All right, welcome to the study group. Welcome, Chuck.
Thank you, Derek.
Welcome everyone at home. Kitty's somewhere.
Yes, he is.
I know it's been a while, so we're happy to get back to it with the studying. Maybe bear with us a little bit if we are a little slow.
A little rusty.
But today we're going to be talking about some really exciting stuff. If you've ever wondered about how the Urantia book ties in with the ancient aliens, the Anunnaki, the Tree of Life, flying birds, the Nephilim, all of this stuff we're going to cover here. So if you've always wondered how you can connect the Urantia book and the Anunnaki and all that ancient Mesopotamian stuff, this is the episode to watch, and hopefully it'll empower you to put some things together. So this is going to be a good one.
Yes, indeed. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I know Chuck has put a lot of work into this one, so if you can bear with a lot of the content, but it's valuable stuff.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so let's get started with our opening slide here. This is the Story of Dalamatia.
Putting this in the time sequence of the podcast we've done previously, this would sort of be the next chapter in the story. Picking up 500,000 years ago and concurrent with the appearance of the six-colored or Sangic races, Caligastia, the Planetary Prince, arrived on Urantia. This image kind of has a double meaning. And obviously, this is the sun rising over the earth. But Caligastia is a high sun of universe origin. And the intention of his arrival was to bring light to this planet, bring enlightenment and get us started on creation of civilization. So we're going to be telling the story of the first 300,000 years of his reign prior to the rebellion, when all things were good and he was behaving and doing what he was supposed to do. And that's where the idea of this light comes in. Yeah,
one thing to keep in mind during this show is that we're going to be talking about a lot of this organization in a positive light, even though maybe we will get into the rebellion in the future. But we're just going to talk about the initial intentions of these missions.
Right, exactly, which are all good.
Okay, so here is a nice rendition of Dalamatia that Chuck put together. And this is the city of the Planetary Prince, which was Caligastia, which is the initiation of the first city on this planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll look a little closer at this illustration in a few slides ahead. But you can see the location, and it's kind of, you can almost imagine the Persian Gulf off there in the distance. It was near water, but it was a beautiful location.
Yeah, so let me go to the map here just so we can get an idea of where we're talking about here. So here's the Persian Gulf, and if you remember where we last left off, we had the Sangic races. They came from the highlands of India, and they all migrated. And now here we have Dalmatia, the first city that shows up right here in the mouth of the Persian Gulf. This isn't exactly where it was. They say it's submerged underwater currently, but this is kind of a close proximity of where it might have been right at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. All right, so some of the tie-ins and some of the story of what we're going to talk about here, maybe you want to talk about how we're going to run it down.
So this slide, as a reference slide going forward, you can come back to this slide just to get a sense of where we are in the sequence of the story. But we're going to start out by talking about ancient myths and legends that exist, that have been discovered, old Sumerian tablets and things like that, and try and show how some of these ancient myths and legends tie into this revealed story that we're going to be sharing today. So to set the stage for that, we're going to look at levels of universe administration, given that these are superhuman characters, or at least some of them are, and talk a little bit about who they were and their nature, you might say. Then we'll look a little bit at the mission of the Planetary Prince. What is the purpose of the Planetary Prince, which, of course, was to establish a world center for civilization. And then we're going to talk about Caligastia a little bit, introduce him. Who was he? What was his nature? What type of being was he? And then that'll lead into talking about Dalmatia. So the physical features, the location, how it was built, what kind of life was lived there. And then we'll look at the prince's staff. So Caligastia came here with a whole staff of beings who were to help with this enterprise. So we'll look at who they were and how they were sustained by the Tree of Life, those kind of interesting questions. And then the organization of the staff into 10 councils that established the schools of Dalmatia and what their purposes were. And then a really interesting part of this story is the origin of the primary midwayers.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll talk about who they were, who they are, who they continue to be, some of them, and how they came into being, which is just, really interesting. And then we'll just get a snapshot of what maybe life was like in Dalmatia. What was going on? What was life like? And then finally, the enduring legacies from those days in the far, far distant past. There are some things, cultural innovations, that have survived from those days. So we'll look at a list of those just to appreciate the importance and the influence of this effort. So this is not a quote from the book, but just an explanatory note around the fact that the story of Dalmatia that we find in the Urantia book, you can either take it as a literal history or simply as a fascinating story. Either way, whether you believe it or you just take it as a fascinating story, it is an epic tale that touches on both our origin and our destiny as a human race. It's the story of the initiation of cultural civilization on our world, which, according to this information, was a celestial gift from the distant past. This idea is supported actually by existing documents that have been discovered. And I'll just read this. Legends from ancient Mesopotamia, dating back to nearly 500,000 years ago, which is where we're picking up the story, are remarkably similar to the story we'll be sharing from the Urantia book. The primary source for these legends is the Babyloniaca, which I had never heard of until I started researching for this podcast, which is a text written in the Greek language by the Babylonian priest and historian Berosus in the 3rd century BC, allegedly based on many books which had been preserved with great care at Babylon. So we have this Greek Mesopotamian historian who researched these documents and put together a story very similar to what we're going to be sharing today. And part of this story, as preserved in the conventional Greek view, there's two different points of view here. Contrary to the conventional Greek view that civilization was the product only of human action over time, Berosus held to the traditional Mesopotamian view that civilization was largely driven by divine revelation and intervention. At the core of civilization is a body of basic principles dealing with the various areas of civilized life communicated by the gods to man at Babylon more than 432,000 years ago. So this has a remarkable parallel to the story we'll be sharing today.
Yeah, it's getting closer. So it's guidelines that we can work in. It's a framework that we can work in.
Right,
Revelation.
Exactly. So as an example, here's a quote from Berosus. He didn't write this, but it's ancient Sumerian legend that he found and uplifted that says that, referring to he, which we believe would be Caligastia at the time, he gave to the men the knowledge of letters and sciences and every kind of art. He taught them to construct houses, to found temples, to found cities, to compile laws, and explain to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He revealed to them the seeds of the earth and showed them how to collect fruits. He gave men everything which is connected with the civilized life. So these are the same priorities we'll see in play in Dalmatia. That was the purpose of the city of Dalmatia, to be a center for the bestowal of this knowledge, this type of knowledge, the arts of civilization. And then we'll see that echoes of this original civilization and its tragic downfall persist in our most ancient myths and legends. The story of Dalmatia brings coherence to these surviving narrative fragments from long ago. So here we have a Sumerian seal impression, and you just look at that and you wonder what is going on there.
Yeah, there's a lot of intriguing things.
A lot of intriguing elements here. So we'll see how these things tie together. And then from the book we hear, already have archaeologists found these ancient Sumerian clay tablets, which tell of this earthly paradise where the gods first blessed mankind with the example of civilized and cultured life. Next slide.
Yeah, these echoes in ancient myths and legends.
Yes.
It's a very interesting story that, a lot of people know about the Fandor, but that shows up in Sumerian history as the Anzu bird or Anzu bird. And there's some really interesting correlations and tie-ins with what the Urantia book talks about with the original domestication of the Fandor. So this tale is called Lugal Banda and the Anzu bird. And one thing we'll learn later is that one of the corporeal staff members who was in charge of animal husbandry and domestication was named Ban. So Lugal in Sumerian means a great man or teacher. And so here we have a teacher, Banda. And so Bond's group were successful in training the great Fandors, the passenger birds. And then from that story, Lugal Banda and the Anzu bird, we have a correlating line where from the tablet it says, when at daybreak the Anzu bird stretches himself and cries out, the ground quakes in the Lulubi mountains. Anzu was herding wild bulls of the mountains. He held a live bull in his talons. Lugal Banda is wise, and he achieves mighty exploits. So it's just kind of giving a little insight into some of that story, and there's a little bit more into that story I can read for you, and this is kind of where Lugal Banda makes friends with the Anzu bird by befriending and caring for the chick of the Anzu bird. But it's also kind of like an evolutionary interpretation of perhaps Bond domesticating the first Fandor as well.
Yes, indeed.
So I can read that real quick. Lugal Banda and the Anzu bird. In preparing the sweet celestial cakes, Lugal Banda added carefulness to carefulness. He kneaded the dough with honey and added more honey to it. He set them before the young nestling, before the Anzu chick, and gave the baby sheep's fat and fatty meat to eat. He popped the cakes into its beak. He settled the Anzu chick in its nest, painted its eyes with kohl, dabbed white cedar scent onto its head, and put up a twisted roll of salt meat. He withdrew from the Anzu's nest and awaited him in the mountains where no cypresses grow. When the Anzu bird returns, it is startled by the chick not responding to its call. But when it finds out what happened, it is very pleased with Lugal Banda. In appreciation, the Anzu bird grants him the power to travel at unbelievable speed. Lugal Banda is able to travel the incredible distance over 7 mountain ranges within a day's time. Now, that ties into what the Urantia book talks about with the Fandor, their distance that they can cover too. And in that quote from paper 52, it says, these enormous birds are able to carry 1 or 2 average-sized men for a non-stop flight of over 500 miles, maybe 7 mountains.
Yes.
On some planets, these birds are of great service since they possess a high order of intelligence, often being able to speak many words of the languages of the realm. These birds are more intelligent, very obedient, and unbelievably affectionate. So you can kind of get an idea of why one might call it a god, or some have divine rights that, you know, maybe it's not just an animal, but here we have depictions in cylinder seals of this bird, you know, flying with bulls and its talons and stuff like that. So there obviously is something there, as well as, you know, if you study Native American history, they talk about the Thunderbird, and there's other stories. We even did Adamson and Rata, where Adamson was flying on a bird, right?
Yes, indeed. And we'll see more about this as we go along too.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a fun and exciting thought.
Well, it's nice to be able to put some of this stuff to pictures that, you know, a lot of your Urantia book readers have maybe kind of questioned about, and it's kind of been a bric-a-brac effort. Instead, let's put this into some cohesiveness here. Yeah, yeah.
So another possible example of an ancient preservation of this ancient knowledge through myths and legends is this fascinating fragment from a cylinder seal that Derek came across. I'll just read what it says here. A planetary prince is not visible to mortal beings, is a test of faith to believe the representations of the semi-material beings of his staff. So you look at this, there's, you know, the face is missing. So the question that comes up, at least for me and Derek and some, not many others, but what we wonder here, is this a depiction of Caligastia or something related to that, because the face is missing? Is that an indication of invisibility, in other words? So this remarkable image is from a seal impression found in Urkesh, an ancient Hurrian city in northern Mesopotamia. So the Hurrians were another culture. There's the Akkadians, there's the Sumerians, but there are also the Hurrians, and they're farther north.
Let me show where that is real quick.
Okay.
So we got the map here, and you can see where we started, the Persian Gulf. And as we go north, we're in Iraq up in here, and then up in northern Iraq, in between, it's in Syria technically, but it's right in between Iraq and Syria on that border.
Okay, great. Urkesh, and the thing that's interesting about Urkesh is that it was closely associated with Anu, who we're conjecturing or considering is another name for Caligastia, and it was the home of his foremost son. We know Anu, the sky father of Sumerian legends, as Caligastia from the days of Dalmatia. His sons were the superhuman staff from Jerusalem, known today as the Anunnaki. This faceless figure is believed to be a Hurrian king, but I could find no explanation for why his face seems to be purposefully missing. Could this be a depiction of Anu's invisibility, or a portrayal of royal affiliation with the invisible prince? Today's archaeologists, of course, are not likely to see this as a literal invisible being, but the information we have from the Urantia book, it kind of leads to that speculation.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about some of the iconography that comes out of that region, I mean, Göbekli Tepe isn't that far from that region that we're just talking about.
Okay.
And so you will see headless figures. And I've only seen one other headless figure like that, and it was from a Göbekli Tepe where there's a headless figure literally riding a fan door.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and it's on the bottom of one of those T columns that they have. Maybe I'll share it in one of the future episodes or something like that. But might be something that there's a commonality in the headless figures, as well as we'll show later that there's a commonality in humans with animal faces.
Right. That's another variation that we'll see as we go along. So just to kind of set the scene here with our cast of characters, they're going to be the main players in this story. They break into two groups. There's the visible players, but then there's the invisible players, invisible to human eyes.
Right.
So the visible players break down into three groups. There are the humans, who are the students and volunteers from surrounding tribes that chose to live in the city of Dalmatia and receive the teachings that were offered there. But then there are also modified humans and superhumans in human form. So these next two groups are part of the staff, Caligastia's staff. And the modified humans are gathered together 100 superior Andonites. So if we remember from the previous podcast, the Andonites were the first race of humans.
Andon Infanta.
The offspring.
Their offspring and generations.
Right. Right. So they selected 100 superior Andonites. They were selected as germplasm contributors to the material bodies that were constructed for the prince's volunteer staff from Jerusalem, the system capital. These Andonites were then modified to become undying by sustenance from the tree of life, enabling them to live on indefinitely with the prince's staff. So the prince's staff were full-on superhuman, but the modified Andonites were sort of quasi-superhuman, based on the fact that they could survive indefinitely from the tree of life. The superhuman in human form were 100 ascendant citizens from the system capital who volunteered to serve here as the corporeal material staff for the Dalmatia project. They were given human form, but were superhuman in nature, in experience, and capability. Sustained by the tree of life, they were the first to bring superhuman revelation into human affairs. So the corporeal staff, these superhumans in human form, are a really important group because they bridged the gap from the superhuman to the human. So they looked human, they could relate to humans, but they were actually bringing a superhuman revelation to the planet. So this is part of the strategy for how that was done. Mm-hmm. It was essential to have these human-like beings that humans could relate to, right? Okay, so then beyond that, we have the invisible players to humanize, which included large numbers of angels and ministering spirits who came along to help with the project. And there was Caligastia, who was the assistant of the Planetary Prince. It was Caligastia, our one-time Planetary Prince. And then Satan, Lucifer's first lieutenant, was an emissary to the 607 inhabited worlds then in Satania. So he would come here periodically, and we'll learn about that later, what the consequences of that might have been. And then, of course, Lucifer, who is the one-time sovereign of Satania, our system of inhabited worlds, which he took into rebellion. So this is kind of a reference slide. Kind of come back to this. All right, so now we're going to just take a quick look at some of these beings and the names that they have in mythological terms.
It has really helped me to have a function in which I can use all of these things and a place to kind of correlate some of the names just for help. So we have Anu or An, and that's how I see Caligastia. He's known as the Sky Father. He's a secondary Lanonandek Son, and he's the deposed Planetary Prince. He's the one who led this planet into rebellion. Then we have the Anunnaki, which is the offspring of An and Ki And that's what we will find as the corporeal staff. And that's these superhumans who are taking from the tree of life, considered gods or whatnot. Then we have the Igigi, and these are all terms that come up in Sumerian lore. The Igigi are modified Andanites. They're like Anunnaki, kind of, but they were originally made to serve Anunnaki. And that's a comparable to what these Andanites were, contributing life plasm to the corporeal staff, and then kind of their counterpart and support, second in command or their assistants. Part of the story in the Sumerian folklore is that the Igigi rebelled. And so then the Anunnaki created humans. And we'll see how these modified Andanites, a lot of them stayed loyal to Van during the rebellion, and then the subsequent creation of the Nodites or the Nephilim. So those are stories that are intertwined with each other, and I'll clarify those later. Then we have Enki, which I see comparable to Van. There's a lot of text in Sumerian tablets that reflect the steadfastness and wise decisions of Enki, and how he brought a lot of civilization throughout the planet at that time, post-rebellion, just as Van did. He was part of the corporeal staff, director of Supreme Court, and they even talk about in some of the Sumerian stories how Enki was chosen for his wise decision-making. And then we have Enlil, which in my mind reflects Nod. Not all of you guys are going to agree with this, but to me it's been the most cohesive way for me to put this all together, and it does reflect in some of the Sumerian tablets as well. Enlil being of Nod, a brother of Enki, but they were always kind of at odds with one another. Enki was always supporting humankind, while Enlil was always pissed off at humankind, essentially. Nod was another corporeal staff member, and he was the director of the Commission on Trade and Industry. And then, like I said, then the Nephilim or the Nodites. And that's when Dalmatia did go into rebellion, and the corporeal staff were ordered to procreate with the humans and the modified Andanites who were around. And that's what brought the Nephilim or Nodites. So those are the same thing. And that's why I say that kind of reflects that Igigi rebellion, and then they created humans. So, and we'll get into more of these details. This is just kind of a touch about how it works.
Yeah, right. So moving on, again, for reference for later, because these terms are going to come up as we go along. So if you want to go back to the slide and use it as a reference slide, that's kind of its intention. But this shows the levels of administration in our local universe. So the idea here, the concept, is that we're living in a well-ordered universe that actually is governed by celestial administration. And these are sort of the levels of the local government of that administration. So on the lowest level, we have our planet, which is Urantia, and evolutionary worlds like ours receive the overcare of the lowest level of universe administration. So there is a superhuman administration on this world, even though we don't see it. It's here, and it was here even then. Going up to the next level, we have Satania, which is the name of our local system of 619 inhabited worlds, projected to include about 1,000 worlds. So it has its own capital sphere, its own administrative organization, and the capital of Satania is Jerusalem. This is an architectural world as opposed to an evolutionary world like ours. It's an architectural world that's designed and created for its specific purpose. And it's surrounded by the Satania headquarters world. So the corporeal staff were evolutionary mortals that had reached the level of Satania. So they were highly evolved. And it was from these ascending mortals on Satania that the volunteers were taken to come here to work with the Dalmatia project. So you'll hear Jerusalem come up a few times, and that's just so you know what that's referring to. Norlashadek is then the next level, which is what the Urantia book calls the constellation level, that embraces 100 systems. So there's 100 systems in a constellation, and our constellation is Norlashadek. And Edentia is the capital sphere of Norlashadek, and it has its own another architectural world with associated worlds. Nebadon, then, is the name of our local universe that embraces 100 constellations, or approximately 10 million inhabited worlds. Salvington is then the capital of Nebadon. This architectural sphere is the home of our creator son, Michael, who we know as Jesus, and our creative mother spirit. Nebadon is their co-creation and their domain of responsibility, and we are their universe children. I know it's a lot to take in at once if you're not already familiar with this information, but you can always refer back to this if these terms come up and you forget what they refer to, which is totally understandable.
All right. Well, let's get going. This is from paper 50. The mission of the prince. While belonging to the order of Lanonandek Sons, we're talking about Caligastia here, the planetary princes are so specialized in service that they are commonly regarded as a distinct group. All planets which are inhabited by evolutionary mortal creatures have assigned to them a planetary ruler of this order of sonship. His work is designed to foster the development of planetary civilization. So that's just kind of to set the stage of what a planetary prince does. And then the prince's corporeal staff, as we talked about, those superhuman types, early organized the planetary schools of training and culture, wherein the cream of the evolutionary races are instructed and then sent forth to teach these better ways to their people. These schools of the prince are located at the material headquarters of the planet, as we showed Dalmatia. In the headquarters settlement on your world, every human habitation was provided with abundance of land. The students and teachers in the prince's schools were all agriculturalists and horticulturalists.
So again, we're projecting forward into civilization and the benefits of agricultural life.
Right.
Now, just to expand on this a little bit, the mission of this idea of the mission of a planetary prince, they explain that the time in Dalmatia, people that were actually residential in Dalmatia, their time was about equally divided between the following pursuits: physical labor, which included cultivation of the soil associated with home building and embellishment; social activities, play performances and cultural social groupings; educational application, which included individual instruction in connection with family group teaching, supplemented by specialized class training; vocational training, which were the schools of marriage and homemaking, the schools of art and craft training, and the classes for the training of teachers, secular, cultural, and religious. And then finally, there's spiritual culture, the teacher brotherhood, the enlightenment of childhood and youth groups, and the training of adopted native children as missionaries to their people. So we can see here the beginnings of a foundation for civilization and the organized system of learning and education, which is over long periods of time will yield a progressive culture that's sound and successful. That was sort of the idea. Sure. But it's these 5 things are an interesting breakdown of realms of importance that we can even still consider today. We're all sort of engaged in all of these things even now.
Yeah. Well, from such a world center of culture and achievement, there gradually radiates to all people an uplifting and civilizing influence, which slowly and certainly transforms the evolutionary race. And also from paper 50, it talks about how the loyal princes of the inhabited worlds are permanently attached to the planets of their original assignment. So they're supposed to be here forever, essentially. Mm-hmm. A successful planetary prince continues on as the ruler of his realm, and that just wasn't the case for our planet.
Yeah. So this image is intended to represent what might have been. If Dalmatia continued to exist today, which was the plan for that to happen, who knows what it would have looked like, but this is an illustrative rendering of what that could have looked like.
All right. Well, let's get into a couple quotes about Caligastia and our planetary prince. I'll start reading. So this is from paper 35. And so talking about Michael here, the creator son and the universe mother spirit, unite for the purpose of bringing into existence this order of universe sonship, the Lanonandeks, which is what Caligastia is. They are best known as system sovereigns, the rulers of the local systems, and planetary princes, the administrative heads of the inhabited world. So we know that Lucifer, Caligastia, Satan, they're all Lanonandeks.
Right, correct.
Right. Okay. So moving on. Our local universe has been unfortunate in that over 700 sons of the Lanonandek order have rebelled against the universe government, thus precipitating confusion in several systems and on numerous planets. We have had so much administrative trouble in Nebadon because our sons of the Lanonandek order have been created with such a large degree of personal liberty in choosing and planning. They were so created that they might better understand and draw near to the evolutionary creatures dwelling on the worlds of time and space. They also stand in great danger of going astray, of departing from the acceptable technique of universe government. But these Lanonandeks, especially the primary order, are the most able and versatile of all orders, of all local universe administrators. So they're just kind of letting you know how tough it can be when you're kind of so far removed, kind of out on your own. And so loyalty can be a challenge.
Right. And in future ages, when they're all tested and proven out, then they have a higher degree of loyalty and things are going to be good. But it's rough in the beginning.
Okay. Caligastia was a Lanonandek Son, number 9,344 of the secondary order. He was experienced in the administration of the affairs of the local universe and the management of the local system of Satania. Lucifer elevated Caligastia to a position on his personal staff, and he acceptably filled 5 successive assignments of honor and trust. Caligastia very early sought a commission as Planetary Prince, but repeatedly, when his request came up for approval in the constellation councils, it would fail to receive the assent of the constellation fathers. So he did apply over and over, but they kept getting rejected, essentially. And so Caligastia seemed especially desirous of being sent as planetary ruler to a decimal planet or life modification world. His petition had several times been disproved before he was finally assigned to Urantia, which is a life modification and a decimal planet. Caligastia went forth from Jerusalem to his trust of world dominion with an enviable record of loyalty and devotion to the welfare of the universe of his origin and sojourn. Notwithstanding a certain characteristic, restlessness, coupled with a tendency to disagree with the established order in certain minor matters. And so the Melchizedek says, I was present on Jerusalem when the brilliant Caligastia departed from the system capital. On that eventful day, 1,500,000 years ago, I really regarded Urantia as being most fortunate to have such an experienced, brilliant, and original mind at the helm of the world affairs. And this is still a Melchizedek speaking. I did not then comprehend that Caligastia was insidiously falling in love with himself. I did not then so fully understand the subtleties of personality pride. And then in another part, they tell us the devil is none other than Caligastia, the deposed planetary prince of Urantia and a son of the secondary order of the Lanonandeks. So what we've come to know as a devil was actually our one-time planetary prince. So from the world's first city, the headquarters of the planetary prince was situated in the Persian Gulf region of those days, as I showed on the map earlier, in the district corresponding to later Mesopotamia. The climate and landscape in the Mesopotamia of those times were in every way favorable to the undertakings of the prince's staff and their assistants. There were almost 1/2 billion primitive human beings on Earth at the time of the prince's arrival, and they were well scattered over Europe, Asia, and Africa. The prince's headquarters was at about the center of world population.
So these 500 million human beings were mostly Andinites, and we know that the Sangiks had also emerged. So there were some Sangiks, colored races, but it was mostly Andinite at that time. So going on here, talking about Dalmatia is the world's first city. Here again, we have this illustration, and the quote that goes with this says that the headquarters of the planetary prince on Urantia was typical of such stations on young and developing spheres. The nucleus of the prince's settlement was a very simple but beautiful city, enclosed within a wall 40 feet high. This world center of culture was named Dalmatia in honor of Caligastia, who was Caligastia's assistant. Going to the next here. The city was laid out in 10 subdivisions with the 10 councils, the corporeal staff, situated at the centers of these subdivisions. So you can see the sort of taller red brick buildings. There's 10 of them, so those sort of indicate those centers. Centermost in the city was the temple of the unseen Father. The administrative headquarters of the prince and his associates were arranged in 12 chambers immediately grouped about the temple itself. So these were superhuman administrators, so I didn't quite know how to illustrate those chambers, but just it gives an idea of how things were arranged. So going on and talking about the city, it said it's enclosed within a wall 40 feet high.
Right.
And the purpose of an ancient city wall was to protect against ferocious beasts, as well as to prevent surprise attacks by hostile humans. Those living without the walls, outside the city and in the forest, were dependent on tree dwellings, stone huts, and the maintenance of night fires. By the use of traps, great progress was made in animal subjugation. So we can see this is going to the very early days of civilization. Talking about
how do they make that wall?
Yeah, they make that wall. Yeah, the city represented the best practices of those days in building material, which was brick. So this is a little brick factory here. Very little stone or wood was used. Home building and village architecture among the surrounding peoples were greatly improved by the Dalmatia example. So everything about Dalmatia was intended to teach and demonstrate.
And so learn by doing.
Learn by doing. So this is an example of that.
Well, talking about the buildings in the first city, the buildings of Dalmatia were all one story, as we saw in that image, except the council headquarters, which were 2 stories, and the central temple of the Father of all, which was small but 3 stories in height. From the arrival of Prince Caligastia, planetary civilization progressed in a fairly normal manner for almost 300,000 years. Urantia progressed very satisfactorily in its planetary career up to the times of the Lucifer rebellion and the concurrent Caligastia betrayal. Now, we're not going to go over the rebellion in this episode, but in the next one we will. At the outbreak of the rebellion, Dalmatia had a resident population of almost 6,000. This doesn't include the visitors and observers, who always numbered more than 1,000. The country around the city was quite well settled within a radius of 100 miles.
So that's what this slide is intended to show, how things might have looked in the settled areas around the city.
Right. Okay. And then all planetary princes under the universe administrative jurisdiction of Gabriel, the chief executive Michael, while in immediate authority, they are subject to the executive mandates of the system sovereigns. As we talked about, Lucifer was the system sovereign of our system, Satania. The planetary prince of Urantia, Caligastia, was not sent out on his mission alone, but was accompanied by the usual corps of assistants and administrative helpers. The prince of a newly inhabited world is surrounded by large numbers of the ministering spirits. As we talk about the prince's staff, we also get introduced to the assistant of Caligastia. And at the head of that group that assisted Caligastia was Caligastia, the associate assistant of the planetary prince. Caligastia was also a secondary Lanonandek Son, being number 319,407 of that order. He ranked as an assistant at the time of his assignment as Caligastia's associate. The entire staff of a world ruler consists of personalities of the infinite spirit and certain types of higher evolved beings and ascending mortals from other worlds. Such a staff averages about 1,000, and as the planet progresses, this corps of helpers may be increased up to 100,000 or more.
So the personalities of the infinite spirit would be the angels and similar related beings, and the ascending mortals from other worlds would be the corporeal staff, in our case. The planetary staff included a host of celestial beings, but from your standpoint, meaning our standpoint, the most interesting group of all were the corporeal members of the prince's staff. And by corporeal, they mean physical, visible, looking like humans. The corporeal members of the prince's staff, sometimes referred to as the Caligastia 100. These 100 rematerialized members of the prince's staff were chosen by Caligastia from over 785,000 ascendant citizens of Jerusalem who volunteered for embarkation on the Urantia adventure. Each was from a different planet, and none were from Urantia. This core of material helpers constitutes the connecting link between the prince and the world races. This next slide sort of shows the arrival of the corporeal staff. You have to remember, these are highly evolved, superhuman, ex-humans, you might say, mortals, from Jerusalem. So they had to be transported from Jerusalem to this world. So these Jerusalem volunteers were brought by seraphic transport, meaning angelic transport, from the system capital to Urantia. And upon arrival, they were held in seraphim. They were held in this enclosure of the seraphim that brought them until they could be provided with personality forms of the dual nature of special planetary service. Literal bodies consisting of flesh and blood, but also attuned to the life circuits of the system. The life carriers, which are a high type of local universe being, who they refer to as the architects of form, provide such volunteers with new physical bodies, which they occupy for the periods of their planetary sojourn. These personality forms, while exempt from the ordinary diseases of the realms, are, like the early Urantia bodies, meaning the bodies we'll have in the next life, they are subject to certain accidents of a mechanical nature. So here we have the life carriers creating those bodies. So they explain further here by saying that sometime before the arrival of those 100 Jerusalem citizens, the two supervising life carriers resident on Urantia, having previously perfected their plans, petitioned Jerusalem and Urantia for permission to translate the life plasm of 100 selected survivors of the Andon Infanta stock into the material bodies to be projected for the corporeal members of the prince's staff. Going to the next slide. Accordingly, 50 males and 50 females of the Andon Infanta posterity, representing the survival of the best strains of that unique race, were chosen by the life carriers. With one or two exceptions, these Andonite contributors to the advancement of the race were strangers to one another. They were assembled from widely separated places by coordinated thought adjuster direction and seraphic guidance. This transfer of the life plasm was important because it's what made the corporeal staff able to reproduce, which was part of the plan for later. So they needed that life plasm to have that capability. So they explain here that the 100 human subjects, these were the Andonites, were given into the hands of the highly skilled volunteer commission from Avalon, who directed the material extraction of a portion of the life plasm of these Andon descendants. This living material was then transferred to the material bodies constructed for the use of the 100 Jerusalem members of the prince's staff. So those were the bodies created by the life carriers, as we saw in that previous slide. So the bodies were designed and created, and then this life plasm was added to them. From the time of the arrival of the seraphic transports bearing the 100 Jerusalem volunteers until they became conscious, threefold beings of the realm, consumed exactly 10 days. So this whole process of life plasma extraction, creating the bodies, putting it all together, consumed exactly 10 days. These transactions, together with the literal creation of special bodies for the Caligastia 100, gave origin to numerous legends.
Yeah, this is where we get stories of the gods coming down,
right,
creating mankind and stuff like that.
Exactly. So this image just sort of represents that idea. Going on, in skin color and language, these materialized members of Caligastia's staff followed the Andonic race. They partook of food, as did the mortals of the realm, with this difference. The recreated bodies of this group were fully satisfied by a non-flesh diet. So this is an important detail. The only similarity between the corporeal staff and the Andonites was their skin color. Their form, their look was created by the life carriers to be consistent with who they were as ascendant beings. But in skin color, they were similar to the Andonites. The Caligastia 100 were personally immortal or undying. There circulated through their material forms the antidotal complements of the life currents of the system, and had they not lost contact with the life circuits through rebellion, they would have lived on indefinitely.
Yeah, and now let's talk about how that was.
Yes, indeed.
So that brings up the Tree of Life, something that we've heard about throughout history in many different forms, but Urantia book kind of reveals some new insight about it. The Tree of Life had these antidotal complements of Satania life currents, and they were derived from the fruit of the Tree of Life, a shrub of Urantia, which was sent to Urantia by the Most Highs of Norlashadek. This tree grew in the central courtyard of the Temple of the Unseen Father, and it was the fruit of the Tree of Life that enabled the material and otherwise mortal beings of the prince's staff to live on indefinitely. And there's depictions throughout history, as we see in this seal over here. And so while of no value to the evolutionary races, the super sustenance was quite sufficient for continuous life upon the Caligastia 100 and also upon the 100 modified Andanites who are associated with them. So when we look at some of these images of bird-headed beings, that's kind of the ancient way of depicting a human who achieved immortality. Mm-hmm. So these modified Andanites literally achieved immortality by getting some of the plasm and then being uplifted through this Tree of Life. They maintained their immortality.
So it's amazing to see all that in this ancient.
Yeah. You
see the Tree of Life, you see them paired up.
Yeah,
it's quite remarkable.
At the time the 100 Andanites contributed their human germplasm to the members of the prince's staff, the life carriers introduced into their mortal bodies the complement of the system circuits, and thus were they enabled to live on concurrently with the staff, century after century, in defiance of physical death. These 100 Andanites were made aware of their contribution to the new forms of their superiors, and these same 100 children of the Andan tribes were kept at headquarters as the personal attendants of the prince's corporeal staff. So just as Chuck was talking about these assistants and how valuable it was, going back to that slide, you see perhaps the Anunnaki or the corporeal staff in the inner closest to the tree, and then on the outside their assistants or these modified Andanite depictions.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now we're going to look at the 10 councils and schools of Dalmatia. To me, I think this is one of the most interesting parts of this story, are these 10 councils. But let me just begin by reading this slide. The 100 were organized for service in 10 autonomous councils of 10 members each. Each of the 10 planetary commissions set about slowly and naturally to advance the interests entrusted to them. Their plan consisted in attracting the best minds of the surrounding tribes, and after training them, sending them back to their people as emissaries of social uplift. So in this slide, we can see the heads of the 10 councils.
And that's their associate name.
That's the names that we find in the Urantia book for these.
So coming up first, we have
Ang, who is the director of the Council of Food and Material Welfare. So I just want to point out that these 10 councils were intended to continue on into the future. We would still have them today, and they would still be looking over and helping and guiding and directing whatever area of civilizational evolution they were assigned to. So you can imagine the Council on Food and Material Welfare, how our nutritional habits could still be improved. Our understanding of all of that would still be an ongoing concern.
Now we're having to do it DIY.
Yeah, it's all DIY now, but they were here to teach us about these things. So
okay, so that's Ang, and then the Council on Food and Material Welfare. Food, water, clothes, and the material advancement of the human species were fostered by this able corps. They taught well digging, spring control, and irrigation, which was a big thing out there, and it still is in Mesopotamia. They taught improved methods of treating skins for use as clothing, so like animal hides and stuff like that. Great advances were made in methods of food storage. Food was preserved by cooking, drying, and smoking. It thus became the earliest property. Man was taught to provide for the hazards of famine, which periodically decimated the worlds.
So the next council was the Board of Animal Domestication and Utilization, directed by Bond.
Who we talked about earlier.
We talked about Bond and how he tamed the Fandors, but he also taught them to tame the oxen and to use animals for transportation and carrying of heavy things. But this, you can imagine how this could be projected into the future with, the preservation of species and habitats and natural habitats and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of concern about species extinction,
right.
Like with the Fandors.
The Fandor went, yeah.
If this council hadn't, was still carried through as intended, they probably would not have gone extinct.
Right.
As just one example.
Yeah. Neither would the dodo bird.
And the dodo bird, right.
So this council was dedicated to the task of selecting and breeding those animals best adapted to help human beings in bearing burdens and transporting themselves, to supply food, and later on, to be of service in the cultivation of the soil. The cow was so improved by careful breeding as to become a valuable source of food. Men were taught to use oxen for burden bearing. The members of this corps first taught men to use the wheel for the facilitation of traction. So that's a big thing to learn that the wheel came around 500,000 years ago, right?
Yeah, big deal.
All right, up next.
Up next, we have Dan, who directed the Council of Advisors regarding the conquest of predatory animals. So one of the things that these Jerusalem citizens and the humans they were helping had to deal with were predatory animals, very hostile, vicious animals. As we'll see, they learned how to subdue some of these species.
Hunting and trapping.
Yeah. But even going forward into now, this is still an issue. Derek and I just watched a documentary about the lampreys.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and how they swarmed into the Great Lakes.
Yeah, took out all the lake trout.
Right, and had to be dealt with.
Uh-huh.
Or here in Colorado, we have issues with pine beetles.
Right.
We take out entire forests.
Yeah.
So this is an ongoing issue.
We need some Dan help.
We need some help from Dan here.
Yeah. It was not enough that early man should try to domesticate certain animals, but he must also learn how to protect himself from destruction by the remainder of the hostile animal world, as well as by hostile humans. Those living in the forest were dependent on tree dwellings, stone huts, and the maintenance of night fires. It was therefore natural that these teachers should devote much time to instructing their pupils in the improvement of human dwellings. And I would put in there, it sounds like he taught self-defense.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah. I think I'd probably be hanging out in that group.
That was an important one.
Yeah. All right, moving on.
Okay, going on, we have the Faculty on Dissemination and Conservation of Knowledge, directed by Fad. So even in those early days, they introduced a system of writing, and there was this preservation of knowledge that was maintained that way. And we can see how this also could project into the present day and even into the future with all of our high-tech communication and storage of data and all these kinds of things. But under this administration, all those things would have been done in a way that could not be weaponized,
right.
The way we sometimes experience. But even so, we can see how this is a very important part of civilization that was initiated in those days.
Yeah, and this group organized and directed the purely educational endeavors of those early ages. They formulated the first alphabet and introduced a writing system. This alphabet contained 25 characters. For writing materials, these early peoples utilized tree barks, clay tablets, stone slabs, a form of parchment, and a crude form of paper-like material made from wasps' nests. The Dalmatia Library held more than 2 million separate records and was known as the House of Fad.
So just imagine if we still had that and also the means to translate these early documents. What a picture that would have provided.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so next we have Nod, who is the director of the Commission on Industry and Trade. So as Dalmatia began to interact with the surrounding tribes and so forth, they began to develop trade relations, and they needed the various means for doing that. And that's, of course, still something that we have today. So the creation of money, for example, would be much better managed under this system if it had continued. It's just one example of what they were about.
Yeah. So this council was employed in fostering industry within the tribes and in promoting trade between the various peace groups. Every form of primitive manufacture was encouraged by this corps. It was among these enlightened groups, educated in the Dalmatia schools, that the first commercial credit was practiced. The world did not improve upon these business methods for hundreds of thousands of years.
So that was a significant contribution.
Yeah.
Going forward to the next group, we have Hap, who directed the College of Revealed Religion. And one of the things that he offered to the people of those days was this prayer. So part of the enterprise of Dalamatia was to introduce revelation, introduce God, help people to understand the nature of God. And as a way to do that, he gave us this prayer, which we might still be using today. And they refer to this as the Father's Prayer. And I'll just read this quickly. It says, Father of all, whose Son we honor, and that would have been Caligastia in those days, look down upon us with favor. Deliver us from the fear of all, save you. Make us a pleasure to our divine teachers and forever put truth on our lips. Deliver us from violence and anger. Give us respect for our elders and that which belongs to our neighbors. Give us this season green pastures and fruitful flocks to gladden our hearts. We pray for the hastening of the coming of the promised uplifter, which had been the next divine son. Yeah, Adam. And we would do your will on this world as others do on worlds beyond.
Yeah, there's a similarity there, I believe, with what then Jesus taught in the Lord's Prayer, perhaps.
Yeah, there are similarities, right?
And so Urantia civilization was literally forged between the anvil of necessity and the hammers of fear, which we did do a podcast on.
We did that. That's true.
This group had made considerable progress in their attempt to substitute creator fear for ghost fear. Before their labors were interrupted, they tried to swap being afraid of ghosts and stuff to having more reverence for the creator.
Right. Deliver us from the fear of all, save you.
Save you.
That's the meaning of that.
The prince's staff presented revelation only as the climax of their exhaustion of the forces of evolution. But Hap did yield to the desire for a form of religious service. His group provided 7 chants of worship, the daily praise phrase, and taught them the Father's Prayer, as we just read. Okay,
going forward, we have Lut, who was directed the guardians of health and life. So this was a big thing, how do you stay healthy? We still struggle with that, and he taught him about the healing powers of sunlight, as we'll see. But going forward, we can easily imagine how there's a lot more to be learned about not just avoiding disease, but actually being healthy. This council would have been all about that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, this council was concerned with the introduction of sanitation and the promotion of primitive hygiene. The great obstacle in the way of promoting hygiene among these ignorant peoples consisted in the fact that the real causes of many diseases were too small to be seen by the naked eye. The great sanitary advance of this epoch came from the dissemination of knowledge regarding the health-giving and disease-destroying properties of sunlight, which is still true to this day.
It certainly is. So going forward now, we have the Council on Art and Science. Again, as we go through these, look at each one of these as a sort of a pillar of civilization and how they were introduced far long ago by these corporeal staff members. So this group was directed by Mech, and the advances in those days, these corporeal staff members knew about all these things, but they couldn't introduce too much too fast. But they do say that they introduced some chemistry and physics, even in those days. And that the advances that we've experienced in technology would be related to this. It would be an outgrowth of this, but it would be managed in such a way that our technology would be more benign and highly functional for these purposes, but not so much used for other purposes like weaponization, for example.
Yeah, and this core did much to improve the industrial technique of early man and to elevate his concepts of beauty. Pottery was advanced, decorative arts were all improved, and the ideals of human beauty were greatly enhanced. The rudiments of physics and chemistry were taught the Dalmatians. They could never overcome their great fear of the explosive power of confined steam. They couldn't get the steam power thing going yet. They were afraid of that.
Yeah.
They were finally persuaded to work with metals and fire. Great progress was made in the home arts.
So it's interesting how they combine art with science. They're really 2 legs of the same venture. Of cultural advancement. Anyway, well, let's move on to Tut, who was in charge, who directed the governors of advanced tribal relations. So we can see how this was no doubt a big deal that could keep maintaining peace between the tribes. And this would advance, of course, through the ages and in terms of our forms of government and how we prevent war and things like that. So we would have had this legacy established in these early days to help us with these difficult issues.
This was the group entrusted with the work of bringing human society up to the level of statehood. These leaders contributed much to bringing about intertribal marriages. The purely military war dances were refined and made to serve valuable social ends. Many competitive games were introduced. Tut and his associates labored to promote group associations of a peaceful nature, to regulate and humanize warfare, to coordinate intertribal relations, and to improve tribal governments.
Mm-hmm. So we would have actually had direction on some of these things. Okay, now we have the final council, which is the Supreme Court of Tribal Coordination and Racial Cooperation, directed by Van. And Van will become a very prominent figure in this whole story as we go forward into the next episode with the rebellion. But here they're talking about directing coordination and cooperation between the races and the nations. So that's something we are still working on.
So this Supreme Council was the court of appeals for all of the other 9 special commissions charged with the supervision of human affairs. This council was one of wide function, being entrusted with all matters of earthly concern, which were not specifically assigned to the other groups. This selected corps had been approved by the Constellation Fathers of Urantia before they were authorized to assume the functions of the Supreme Court of Urantia. And this correlates with what is in the Sumerian tablets too, where they speak of Enki, who was pre-chosen for his wisdom by the gods.
Yeah, yeah, which is true.
Right.
Okay, so now we're going to move into a really interesting part of this story, which is about the origin of the primary midwayers and how that happened. These are actually supernatural beings that were given origin during this time and continue to serve on this planet. So reading this slide, most of the inhabited worlds of Nebadon harbor one or more groups of unique beings existing on a life functioning level about midway between the mortals of the realms and the angelic orders. Hence are they called midway creatures. We have all long since accepted them as one of the essential orders of our combined planetary ministry. On Urantia, there function 2 distinct orders of midwayers, the primary or senior corps, which came into being back in the days of Dalmatia, and the secondary or younger group, whose origin dates from the times of Adam. The corporeal staff were material sex creatures, capable of procreating material offspring, as some of them later did. What we cannot satisfactorily explain is how these 100 can function in the parental role on a supermaterial level, but that is exactly what happened. In conformity to their instructions, the staff did not engage in sexual reproduction, but they did painstakingly study their personal constitutions, and they carefully explored every imaginable phase of intellectual, mind, and Urantia soul liaison. So keep in mind that its corporeal staff were male and female pairs. And, they were having a pretty close relationship, as you can imagine, but non-sexual. And it was during the 33rd year of their sojourn in Dalmatia, long before the wall was completed, that number 2 and number 7 of the Danite group accidentally discovered a phenomenon attendant upon the liaison of their Urantia selves, their soul selves, which is supposedly non-sexual and non-material. And the result of this adventure proved to be the first of the primary midway creatures. This new being was wholly visible to the planetary staff and to their celestial associates, but was not visible to the men and women of the various human tribes. Upon authority of the Planetary Prince, the entire corporeal staff undertook the production of similar beings, and all were successful, following the instructions of the pioneer Danite pair. Thus did the prince's staff eventually bring into being the original core of 50,000 primary midwayers. These creatures constituted the intelligence core of the prince's administration. They ranged far and wide, studying and observing the world races and rendering other invaluable services to the prince and his staff in the work of influencing human society remote from the planetary headquarters. So the midwayers can travel extremely fast. They can, be anywhere on the planet where they were needed, and they did provide these sort of like information gathering service for the staff.
Yeah, as we get further into it, maybe into Adam and Eve, there's reference to them.
We'll learn more about them.
And even in Jesus, with some of the messenger that he sends out.
And some of them are still here. Some of them are still here.
Yeah. So more of life in Dalmatia. We talk about the prince's staff and their family life. The prince's staff lived together as fathers and mothers. They had no children of their own. But the 50 pattern homes of Dalmatia never sheltered less than 500 adopted little ones, assembled from the superior families of the Andonic and Sangic races. Many of these children were orphans. They were favored with the discipline and training of these super parents, and then, after 3 years in the schools of the prince, they entered from 13 to 15. They were eligible for marriage and ready to receive their commissions as emissaries of the prince to the needy tribes of their respective races. So they were kind of brought in, coached up, and sent out.
Exactly.
And that's the Dalmatia model.
That was the model. So they maintained this family life there and demonstrated the ideals of family life. So these corporeal staff pairs functioned in that way.
So now, Hap presented the early races with a moral law. This code was known as the Father's Way and consisted of 7 commandments. They are, you shall not fear nor serve any god but the Father of all. You shall not disobey the Father's Son, the world's ruler, nor show disrespect to his superhuman associates. You shall not speak a lie when called before the judges of the people. You shall not kill men, women, or children. You shall not steal your neighbor's goods or cattle. You shall not touch your friend's wife. You shall not show disrespect to your parents or to the elders of the tribe. And so this was the law of Dalmatia for almost 300,000 years. And many of the stones on which this law was inscribed now lie beneath the waters off the shores of Mesopotamia and Persia. So that's literally right there in between Iraq and Iran, where everybody likes to have a war right now, especially from the West. Jeez.
I need to dig
Let's just bomb our whole history. That sounds like a great idea.
Well, let's dig up some of these tablets.
Yeah. Jeez. Okay.
But you can see the similarity to the 10 Commandments and other moral laws that have guided civilization through the ages. And this was like the first of those.
This is the first no-hide laws, bro.
Yeah, there you go. Something like that. Okay, so going on here with more about life in Dalmatia. We learned that Fad, the one who was in charge of knowledge, sponsored the Dalmatia plan of teaching that was carried out as an industrial school in which the pupils learned by doing and through which they worked their way by the daily performance of useful tasks. Weaving was later introduced by the teachers of art and science. So we can see there were advances long ago in these kind of industrial practices. And this is how they produced products that they would actually sell to other tribes in the beginning of commerce. This plan of education did not ignore thinking and feeling in the development of character, but it gave first place to manual training. The instruction was individual and collective. So they learned to work with leather. It was one of the skills that they developed back in those days. Just a couple more comments about the culture in Dalmatia. They say that slavery to tradition produces stability and cooperation by sentimentally linking the past with the present, but it likewise stifles initiative and enslaves the creative powers of the personality. When the Caligastia 100 arrived, they began the proclamation of the new gospel of individual initiative within the social groups of that day.
Yeah, that's a pretty important one. I'd say individual initiative to this day is important.
It is, and breaking free of tradition when necessary.
Yeah, and that's something that Jesus talked about as well, is the importance of the individual over the system or the method.
Right, and he also taught initiative and originality.
Yeah.
Students were trained to fraternize with younger groups, older groups, and adults, as well as to do teamwork with those of their own ages. They were also familiarized with such associations as family groups, play squads, and school classes. So keeping in mind that a lot of these students were orphans, essentially, brought in from the surrounding tribes. Maybe not all, but these are all important skills that can be learned that they were teaching. The time management of those days was the lunar month, this period being reckoned as 28 days. The 7-day week was introduced by the Dalmatia teachers and grew out of the fact that 7 was 1/4 of 28. So it was in these days in Dalmatia that carrier pigeons were first used, being taken on long journeys for the purpose of sending messages or calls for help. Bond's group, who you remember from the Fandors, were successful in training the great Fandors as passenger birds, but they became extinct more than 30,000 years ago.
Too bad.
Yeah.
Could use a ride right now.
Yeah, way too bad.
So immediately surrounding the city, hundreds of graduates of the prince's schools engaged in animal husbandry, and others carried out the instruction they had received from his staff and their numerous human helpers. A few engaged in agriculture and horticulture.
So this again represents life surrounding Dalmatia.
And so we do have some enduring legacies from a lot of this stuff, so we have some firsts of a few things. And so one of them is courtship before marriage, some kind of training around that. Improved home and family practices, as we showed earlier. The use of an oath to enforce truthful testimony. Remember, that was also one of the laws. Preservation of food by cooking, drying, and smoking, as we saw by Aang. The first written language using an alphabet system, as we saw by Fad. The taboo against cannibalism, more about health and sanitation. The system of commercial credit, as we saw, developed by Nod. The use of the wheel and the 7-day week.
So we can see there that these are the beginnings of civilization that are still continuing today. So then finally, we have a couple of quotes here where they say that we can have little or no concept of the marvelous progress of those faraway times. Practically all of the wonderful human gains of those days were wiped out by the horrible confusion and abject spiritual darkness which followed the Caligastia catastrophe of deception and sedition. In the next episode, we'll learn about these tragic events and the heroism they inspired. We'll also see how this study of the times of Dalmatia can still offer helpful instruction as we labor to overcome the civilizational setbacks of rebellion.
Yeah, so we'll start to see now, well, hopefully we did a good job of getting you up to speed as to what they were doing initially, drawing lines of comparison with the Anunnaki, those who came from another planet or whatever in Sumerian tablets, as well as revealing a little bit more authenticity as to the Anunnaki or corporeal staff's relation to An or Caligastia. And so there is some conspiracy and different information that's out there, especially, there's authors like Zechariah Sitchin, who's out there, who's really prominent as far as creating the narrative around that Anunnaki created humans to mine gold for them. But he took his own interpretations, and I'm not going to go too much into that, but the real professionals disagree with that. And real Assyriologists and the linguists of that time agree with the real definition of Anunnaki, which does say of princely seed or princely offspring of An. And that really correlates more with the prince's staff. Yeah. And so you can see that there's a little bit of conspiracy there that kind of twists revelation, just a little sophistry or whatnot, into a negative perspective of enslaving humans to mine gold. Yeah. And that probably covers the back of those who are actually doing that in real life, who are just humans, as opposed to what divinity and the celestials decided to do or trying to do.
Right, right. And we've learned that the Anunnaki were not actually the offspring of An, that they were existing beings that came from the system capital.
Right, right. The corporeal staff.
The corporeal staff to assist Caligastia.
And just as we talked about with Adamson and Roth, evolutionary interpretation of these certain things are lacking. Yeah. Right. So we might say offspring of instead of really understanding how that works. Right. Or they created humans instead of like what we're talking about, you know, maybe more the Nodites and Nephilim that came later.
They did reproduce.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in that sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. Hopefully this wasn't too much for everyone. It was a lot for us. Thanks for being patient with us. Great work, Chuck. You know, you're invaluable to all of us, and hopefully keep going. Stay with us for our next podcast, because we're going to talk about the rebellion, which is really important. And we just want to say, you know, I know it's taken a while, but this is a lot of hard work to get done. So if you do value these podcasts, I ask you to contribute and to subscribe and to share and to like, because this is hard work, but we feel that it's valuable, and a lot of it. Chuck and I have committed our lives to doing this. Right.
And it's a story. It's the story of this planet. So having this revelatory information, you know, we see as a great gift, because it brings coherence to some of these ancient tales. And to be able to actually see this information reflected in ancient artifacts is quite stunning sometimes to see.
Yeah. There's a feeling that one gets when they study in this field.
Yeah, right.
Well, we invite you to study more in this, and we thank you for joining us. And
thanks for joining us.
God bless. We'll see you next time. Okay. Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you.